Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into some source materials that talk about this huge overarching conflict. I mean, something they claim really shapes, well, everything in human history.
Yeah, it's a framework that touches on some really big, sometimes difficult questions, like God as a warrior, divine justice, that kind of thing.
Definitely challenging.
And to really get what these sources are saying, we have to understand their starting point. This idea of a massive ongoing cosmic war between good and evil,
Yeah.
like the lens they see everything through.
Right. So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack these sources, laying out what they say about where this conflict behind all conflicts started, what's actually at stake. They mentioned the moral law a lot, who this divine commander figure is, and how battles like Jericho are seen as, well, earthly examples of this bigger invisible war.
Exactly. To understand the fight down here, you really have to look up to where it began.
Okay, good place to start. So if this thing affects everything, it couldn't have started on Earth, right? Where do the sources say it actually began?
They're pretty clear on this. It started with a rebellion in heaven.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about equals fighting. This was Lucifer, described as the highest, most powerful created angel, leading a revolt.
Wow. Okay.
And you see hints of this in prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel. They might be talking about the king of Babylon or Tyre on the surface. But the commentators in our sources say, look deeper. They argue these passages actually point to this transcendent angelic being, this rebel who was once close to God's throne, even in Eden, before the fall.
So the earthly kings are kind of symbols or maybe analogies for this older spiritual drama.
That's the idea. And the conflict wasn't initially physical. It was more intellectual, spiritual, Satan's main tactic wasn't brute force. It was subtle deception. Getting into minds, using confusing ideas, seductive arguments. That's how he apparently convinced a third of the angels to join him. And his method, the sources say, is always the same. Twisting or misrepresenting God's word, the law, to replace truth with error. You see it with Eve in the garden. And then later, the same kind of subtle twisting when he tempted Christ.
So it's not just a power grab. It's about challenging the very standard, the law itself.
Precisely. That's the core of it. And this heavenly war, it didn't stay contained up there. The sources are clear that the fallout hit Earth immediately. These rebellious spiritual beings are shown actively trying to mess with God's plans here. Think about the book of Daniel, where you see this angelic struggle directly impacting things on Earth.
Right.
So from this perspective, the conflicts we see on Earth, well, they're kind of inevitable ripples from that bigger, unseen cosmic war. That's the engine driving history, according to these texts.
That's a huge concept, that this conflict over principles in heaven is what's really behind everything. So, okay, connect the dots for us. If it's a cosmic war, what are they fighting over? Not land or resources, presumably. What's the cosmic prize?
The law of God. Plain and simple, according to these sources. That's the central issue.
The moral law, like the Ten Commandments, that foundation of right and wrong.
Yes, but it's broader than just the tablets from Sinai. The sources trace this law way back. Taught by Adam, kept alive by Noah, lived out by Abraham, hundreds of years before Moses went up the mountain. There's that verse about God choosing Abraham because he obeyed his voice, his commandments, his statutes, his laws.
Genesis 26.5, yeah.
Right. So the idea is these eternal principles were known and followed long before they were formally written down for Israel.
That's fascinating. So the law isn't something God just made up at Sinai. It's more like an expression of his own character.
Eternal.
Exactly. Paul calls it holy and just and good. It's seen as this timeless reflection of God's nature, these unchanging principles of righteousness. They're meant to show us what true character looks like and really to protect us from the consequences of going against them.
Okay, if the law is this eternal, universal thing, what does that mean for everyone, whether they've read the Bible or not? Well, that's where judgment comes in. The sources argue that ultimately everyone will be judged by this moral law based on the opportunity they had to know it. Whether that knowledge came through, reason, conscience, tradition, or the written word itself, the law is the standard.
And what's the result of aligning with it or rejecting it?
Rejecting it, the sources say, puts you basically at war with God and even with yourself. There's no peace there. But when someone accepts the law through Christ, it leads to inner transformation, purity of character, and this idea of great peace, harmony with heaven, essentially.
That really sets the stage. Okay, now we can shift to how this big spiritual war plays out on Earth. Let's use Jericho as the case study. If it's all spiritual, why are people fighting with, swords and spears.
Yeah, let's put ourselves there for a second. The Israelites, they've just crossed the Jordan River. They're not exactly a battle-hardened army, right?
Right.
And they're staring at Jericho, this city that's described as completely locked down, heavily fortified, built to withstand a long siege. Totally. They've got basic weapons, maybe slings and spears, against these massive stone walls. The psychology must have been just paralyzing fear.
I can only imagine. And it's right then when Joshua steps away to think, to pray maybe, that he has this encounter, sees this imposing figure dressed for war, sword drawn, looks totally military.
And Joshua asked the obvious question, the practical question. Are you for us or for our enemies? Whose side are you on?
Makes sense.
But the answer he gets is meant to completely shift his perspective. The figure doesn't say, yeah, I'm here to help you guys. He says, no, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come.
Woo!
It flips the whole thing. It's not about which side he's on in their little local fight.
Yeah.
It's about whether Joshua gets it, whether he's aligned with the real commander.
So who is this commander? The sources must identify him.
They do. They state this was Christ before his incarnation, the pre-incarnate Christ, the same divine being who, they say, led them through the wilderness, and calling himself captain of the host, or sometimes Michael the archangel in other related texts. It positions him as the leader of God's loyal heavenly forces.
Okay, pre-incarnate meaning Christ appearing in a divine form before being born as Jesus.
Exactly. He's presented as the central leader of the good guys in this cosmic battle. And his presence there is so holy it makes the ground sacred. That's why Joshua has to take off his sandals.
So he's not just leading Israel's little army, he's commanding this unseen army of angels, too.
That's the claim, the unseen yet real army of angels.
So that changes everything about the battle plan for Jericho, then.
Completely, because this strategy isn't military, it's, well, theological.
Yeah.
It's all about demonstrating God's power and demanding absolute obedience. March silently once a day for 6 days, then 7 times on the 7th day. The only sound allowed, the priest's trumpets. Not battle cries, not weapons clashing, just trumpets.
That silent marching. It must have been psychological torture for the people inside Jericho, but also a massive test of faith and discipline for the Israelites, right? Staring at those walls day after day.
Absolutely. The whole point was to make it undeniably clear that the victory wasn't theirs. It belonged to the commander. And the climax, the long trumpet blast, the people finally shouting, and the walls just collapsing, fell down flat. The sources emphasize no human hand touched the walls. The angels of the Lord overthrew the fortifications.
Incredible. So that miracle wasn't just about taking the city. It was to prove the conquest was God's doing, and maybe even more, to boost the Israelites' own shaky faith.
A very vivid lesson in where the real power lies in this whole cosmic conflict.
Which brings us to maybe the toughest part of all this in the source material. This vexing issue, as they call it, of wars commanded by God, especially the commands for annihilation. If God is love, if peace is the goal, how do the sources square that with this image of a God involved in warfare?
It's crucial to start where the sources start, with God's ideal plan. The original intention, they argue, was for Israel to take the land simply through obedience and trust, without fighting. Think back to the Red Sea crossing. The Lord will fight for you. You just need to be still. That was supposed to be the model.
So warfare wasn't plan A for how God's people were meant to operate.
Definitely not plan A. The sources present warfare as a plan B, maybe even plan C, a consequence of Israel's failure, their constant lack of faith, their complaining, their disobedience after leaving Egypt, because they wouldn't consistently trust God to act directly. He sometimes allowed them or even directed them to participate in war, almost like a reluctant concession used to try and teach them dependence again.
A second best option then. Okay. But that still leaves a really hard part, the command to utterly destroy the Canaanites. The sources claim this was an act of infinite wisdom and goodness. How on earth do they justify that kind of severity?
Yeah, this requires carefully reporting their reasoning, which is framed as judicial. They argue that the Canaanite nations had, over centuries, sunk into what's described as the absolute worst kind of paganism, widespread child sacrifice, extreme immorality, things considered fundamentally corrupt and deeply ingrained.
Okay.
And the sources stress that God didn't just suddenly decide this. They point to God telling Abraham centuries earlier that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. It implies God gave them something like 400 years, a huge amount of time, allowing their choices to play out. essentially giving them chance after chance.
4 centuries. That's a long period of forbearance.
Immense forbearance, yes.
Yeah.
So when the judgment finally came with Joshua, the sources view it not as arbitrary violence, but as a necessary act of divine justice against persistent, deeply entrenched evil that had reached its limit. They even call it a kind of preview of the final judgment. These nations were judged because, in the view of these texts, their cup of iniquity was full.
Wow. Okay, hold on. There's an even more extreme claim in these sources related to this. The idea that because of sin, humanity itself fundamentally forfeited its right to exist. Something like being no longer entitled to a breath of air. That sounds incredibly hard. How do they explain that?
It connects back to the law. If the law is truly holy and just, then the consequence for breaking it, for transgression, is absolute. It's death, separation from the source of life. So from that strict standpoint, sin means forfeiture of everything, life, blessings,
I
rights,
see.
everything. And the only reason, according to this theology, that humanity wasn't just wiped out immediately after sin entered the picture is because of Christ stepping in as mediator, offering to take that penalty himself.
So the very fact that we're alive, breathing, experiencing anything good,
Yeah.
it's solely because Christ intervened.
That's the core assertion. All blessings, every good thing, even life itself, only flows to humanity because of his mediation, his sacrifice. That's why they use this striking language. Every gift, whether it's money, health, talent, even the air we breathe, is stamped with the cross and bears the image and superscription of Jesus Christ. We're living on borrowed time, sustained entirely by his grace.
That completely reframes the idea of giving back to God, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It means, as one source quotes from First Chronicles, all things come from you, and of your own we have given you. We're just returning what was his in the first place, sustained by his sacrifice. It highlights total dependence.
What a lens to view history and even just daily life through. It makes every conflict, whether it's a huge battle like Jericho or just an internal struggle we face, a kind of small reflection of that giant cosmic war. And victory isn't about our strength or smarts.
But about figuring out which side we're on and aligning ourselves with the true commander.
That really is the key takeaway, isn't it?
It is. And the sources bring it right down to the present day. They say, look, a great warfare is going on over every soul between the Prince of Darkness and the Prince of Life. The same battle that decided Jericho's fate is happening inside each of us.
That's the ultimate personal takeaway from this deep dive, then.
I think so. The encouragement is to consciously yield ourselves day by day to the Prince of Life. He knows every struggle, every temptation, and he knows the way through.
Yeah.
So the big question these sources leave us with isn't just about ancient history or angels. It's about right now, today. In the conflicts we face, the choices we make about our own character, are we on his side?